Welcome to Connections, bringing together King's Business School's sharpest minds with first-hand insight from leaders in the world of business, public service, science and beyond.
Welcome to this KBS podcast with me, Professor Crawford Spence, where we are exploring how remote working might be changing the culture in financial services. I'm very happy to have with me today two august industry practitioners. So we have Aoifinn Devitt, who is Head of Investment Ireland at Federated Hermes, which is a major asset management firm. And among other educational institutions, she's also an alumna of King's College London, where not too long ago she did a master's in neuroscience. And also Anthony Gahan, who is founding partner at Wyvern Partners, who specialise mostly in mergers and acquisition advisory. And Anthony has a background in investment banking and also is a King's College alumnus, having done a BA in modern languages and Latin American history as well. So welcome to both of you. Great to have you with us. Just going to kick off with you, Anthony, and just ask you a sort of general question to start. What has been the impact in broad terms for your business of losing face-to-face contact over the last 9 months?
Well, I think it's been pretty dramatic for everybody, to be honest. It is, however, still, I would say, very early days and not sure how long it will last going forward. But I think that, first of all, you have to sort of divide this into whether or not it's small groups of people online talking to you or large groups. And unfortunately, I have both sets. And I think the sort of short answer is that for smaller groups, particularly those people who you actually know, it's not so difficult because you can see them, you can get some sort of reaction out of them, and it's fine. Where I would say, Crawford, that it's really quite difficult is when you're dealing with large groups. So, for example, when we're hosting some team meeting for an IPO where there might be 30 people who are on that call from different professions, it's really quite difficult. And I think one of the issues there is about orchestrating the discussion, because where there are lots of people, it's much, much harder to be able to bring them in a natural way.
Why is that specifically? Why is that more difficult in virtual environments?
Well, I think it's much more difficult because your ability to interact with people and engage with them by looking at them, by, if you want, almost the human gestures, is much, much harder here. So if you want, it becomes much, much harder to have an active discussion which has a logical sequence. Again, people are much more hesitant to be able to talk because they don't know if they're talking over anybody. And indeed, often the technology here is a negative because I happen to have got a very large microphone. Everyone makes fun of this big microphone that I have, but it is actually quite helpful because it means that people can hear me relatively well. But of course, people are coming from different locations and haven't necessarily, done anything other than talking through their laptop or their iPad, or in some cases, just their phone. So it becomes, for those larger meetings, much more I guess, as I say, orchestration. In other words, there has to be a procedure to try and bring in people to give their comments. But I'm not sure that the free flow is as it would have been in a normal conversation if you're all sitting around a big conference room table.
Okay. And Aoifinn, how has losing face-to-face contact impacted your business at Federated Hermes?
It definitely will impact it in different ways. And I would also draw a couple of distinctions. Firstly, it depends on, from a business perspective, if what we're trying to do with our contact is keep the lights on, essentially just keep things running, or actually develop new ideas, grow, innovate. And that goes for relationships too. When we're maintaining existing relationships, I think the switch to remote has been more or less seamless, in that, if we know each other, if we have already developed a rapport, switching to video communication is definitely suboptimal, but it does the trick. When it comes to developing new relationships and to, say, new joiners at the firm who are looking to build a network and actually really get to know the extent of their role and their role's potential, that's extremely difficult not to have face-to-face contact, I believe, because I do think that video communication is suboptimal when it comes to developing new relationships. So new business, new relationship, I think the impact is quite severe. And also it depends on the personality too. We spend a lot of time analyzing that those personalities who need face-to-face contact more than others. And I think what there seems to be universal acceptance of is that there has been some form of leveling of the playing field. I actually find that in a meeting that's held remotely, there seems to be almost equal status given to every player. That's not the same if some are on camera and some are not. I think when some are not on camera, there's definitely less status attached to that. But it does seem to be a forum where introverts feel that they may perhaps have a better opportunity to make a point. They don't feel at such a disadvantage from not having that physical presence in the room. But equally, extroverts or groups who do thrive on the actual face-to-face contact and being with people in person may feel now that they're at a disadvantage from that. So I really think it's falling differently according to the personality, the group, the project nature, and what you're seeking to achieve. It does actually make the remote colleagues feel more included, because whereas in the old days, there would be a conference room where the meeting was held and somebody might be dialing in from, say, a Polycom in the middle of the table. Now, increasingly, everybody is on the same playing field, whether they're dialing in from Dublin or from Pittsburgh. And there is, I think, some ease there. That said, certainly when it comes to, say, areas like a symposium that we were supposed to hold, that was supposed to be all in one room, bringing together different parts of the business internationally, that definitely did not have the same impact when held remotely. It was very successful, but it wasn't the same. They can't be as long, these events, when they're held remotely. They're a fraction of what they would have been. You don't have the networking effect. And I do think you lose some of the impact.
Okay, thanks. So there are positives and negatives then. Thinking about specific mergers and acquisitions deals, Anthony, have you noticed changes in how these are done? Or changes in, the number of opportunities that are out there? Some of these will be related to remote working. Some will be related to other things that have been, engendered by the pandemic. How has the nature of deals changed in the last few months?
Well, I would say pretty dramatically. I certainly agree with Aoifinn about the fact that if you haven't got an existing relationship, so business origination is much, much harder, because I think that is something that really does require personal contact with people to understand them and to convey what you are like to them. So that is a real problem, and I think it's also a real problem from an investment perspective when people are assessing management teams, either for a private equity deal or indeed an IPO, as to whether or not those people are people who have the conviction in relation to their business and what they're saying is the right thing. I think the other element of this, though, is that decision making is pretty hard, I would say, online. And although availability is probably higher than it would have been otherwise, I don't know that's because people are sitting there and their diary has just expanded because they're doing less traveling or whatever. But getting the right people onto the call seems to be easier. However, getting a decision done where you would normally be able to get a decision done in a meeting where you have to get the answer before you leave the room is much, much harder. Because also I think, bizarrely, people just leave arbitrarily because they've got another call that they have to go on to. Whereas in a meeting, for some reason, I'm not entirely sure how this happens, but in meetings, people would get to, the crunch point, make a decision, and if the crunch point hadn't come, they'd wait until they got that done, because these are very important decisions, and it might be about the terms of the deal or the valuation or whatever it is. But online, for some reason, these then get passed on to yet another session. So I would say that in terms of doing transactions, the inefficiency levels of execution of those transactions have gone up. The other element, of course, is on the due diligence side here. The due diligence is that much more difficult as well. So, of course, we're all used to virtual data rooms, and that's all fine. So you can still get your documents there. But a big part of that due diligence exercise is about personal interaction with the team and going through specifics and sitting there, sadly, in an old-fashioned way with bits of paper in front of you so that you can go through your checklist of questions and get those answers. I find that much, much harder to do online.
So you're touching upon assessing management teams in various ways there. And that's something that presumably you have to do as well, even on a regular basis. Have you found that more difficult to do in a remote environment?
Definitely, there is a problem with. I agree with kicking the tires. I think that's the final piece of the due diligence. And what I've seen is actually, even though, as I said, we've all managed relatively successfully to keep the lights on. Trading operations have been even been consigned to people's bedrooms or their studies, and that's pretty phenomenal. But I find it hard to believe that could happen without something falling through the cracks. And I think the problem with everything being remote is you don't even know that something has fallen through the cracks. And now I speak to some private credit managers who are extending loans to companies that have seen their entire cash flow shrivel up or their businesses be shut down. And they've had to amend, extend, pretend, whatever it may be, to get that keep that loan alive, or essentially keep that investment going. But they are doing this without the ability to get on the ground, to kick the tires, to see what's actually going on in their investment. And I do think that really impedes the ability to really execute an operation properly. When it comes to senior management as a whole, I do think that leadership is more challenging in this arena. Building a sense of trust within a team and managing remotely is definitely more challenging.
No, I'd agree entirely with all of that. It is. Again, maybe it's still early days, and as everyone gets more comfortable with this, they speak out a lot more. I do find that there are a number of people. I'm not sure that I share Aoifinn's experience about some of the introverts finding it easier to talk online. I still think that there are a lot of people, particularly in the larger groups, where it's just very difficult to interrupt the flow of somebody who's leading the discussion or somebody who's very senior. If anything, I think it maybe is harder because, again, you don't spot the gap in the conversation. So for you to talk, you've got to find a gap to do so, unless you're particularly persistent and you start talking over the other person. But again, online, that is so much harder because then it just becomes a mess. Nobody can hear anything that's going on. So I think, if this is how it's going to be going forward, we're going to have to learn some more conventions maybe. I do think there are other elements about this which are probably, maybe beyond the what we're talking about here, which are about what are the mental health issues that come out of this. And although I think quite a lot of people are very lucky to have sat in big rooms, big homes with, almost, yes, it may be boring because you'd like to go and meet people in person, but in reality, in a very comfortable position, whereas other people, I think, will be struggling. And even the ones who are in comfortable positions, I think, I feel jaded, I have to say, in relation to some of these discussions, because not that there's something specific happening to me, but it does seem to be incessant. And the blend between the work life and the home life has pretty much disappeared. I know some of us have been quite busy, sort of not alcoholics. I was about to say workaholics is probably the right thing to say. Maybe it's driven to the alcoholic bit as well. But it's the blending between the two worlds is only, a few feet, literally. And I think that is a challenge for everybody going forward.
Aoifinn, have you seen any differences between people at different levels within the organisation in terms of how they've responded or coped with current arrangements?
Yes, I have. And I would say also, I don't even think we know the extent of it yet, because I think we are still in the middle of it. And I think there is some reticence about maybe disclosing the level of anguish or struggle that might be going on in a young person's either their environment or just their professional trajectory. And we perhaps are, because we're still in the middle of it. And essentially, I think I read that even the number of people working from, say, central London has fallen again. Despite the lockdown being lifted, it's now actually declining again. That we're still by no means out of this, so we don't know the true impact. But I have teenage daughters. They're both at college and at school, and I have seen the impact that this had on them when they were not in school. It was quite dramatic and I think quite damaging. I feel that young professionals, and I always try to remember myself as a young professional, they are missing out. They are essentially there's a lost period for them now, a period of training. Anthony mentioned the experience of being able to work with a group of senior people and learn from them. And there is that carrying the briefcase moment which I think is not happening any longer. And that is cannot be replicated online. A lot of what you learn as a young trainee or just a young professional, you absorb from watching. And that is absolutely key. That's no longer being allowed. And I think as senior professionals, we have a duty to go back into the office to continue the work of mentoring, because otherwise, how can we talk about succession planning if we have genuinely got a whole layer in the organization that hasn't been trained? So I feel very strongly about this, and I think it is the most urgent matter that we have to address currently.
That's a great point, and the analogy with schools and lost learning that cannot really be retrofitted is an interesting one. I wonder if, Anthony, you've seen anything similar, or if there's anything you've observed that makes you slightly anxious, and the people that you're mentoring or trying to bring through the ranks just now, that you're worried that they are going to be missing out on something they cannot catch up on later.
I think, again, maybe it's early days. If this continues for an extended period, then I think it is a fundamental fix that is needed to deal with this. And maybe the way of also describing it is about culture. The other thing that I think is really important is, the culture of a business. And that culture is very, very difficult to do if everything is interpreted through, a video screen of some sort and a microphone. And indeed, importantly, again, I think, is this whole thing about culture. Often there are senior people who are defining that culture. Sometimes it's really good and sometimes less good. So maybe, in some cases it's better that they're not doing those things. But let's assume that everybody is driving a good culture. That culture is only picked up, I think, by the off-screen interactions. Again, so this is not just about the discussion in a meeting in a formal way. It's about the small bits that sit around that, which just will never be replicated unless you had an always-on camera. And even then, it just wouldn't work because, of course, that is completely impractical. So I do think that there is a problem. I do agree with the thought that actually this still has some way to go. And when we talk about central London, yes, I think that the numbers are still down in central London. And then people are talking in a way about what is the balance of work from home, this blended delivery. It's blended delivery in an academic or educational sense in certain cases, but equally this whole blend of sometimes at home and sometimes in the office. I struggle to believe that creates the right environment for a continuous, progressive organization. So I am concerned about it, Crawford.
I'd like to just come in on that because I completely agree with that. I don't know how this is really going to work in the sense of, we're talking about percentages going into the office. And if only 10% of the office goes in, well, then your very point of going into the office has kind of disappeared if part of the point was to go in and to network with your colleagues. And I was in central London recently walking around, and it is a depressing place to be at the moment with these wonderful trophy buildings sitting essentially empty. And what struck me was looking back at my own trainee years, I started in New York back in the 90s, is I derived a lot of my sense of pride and my sense of identity from going into an office like that was a trophy building in Midtown Manhattan. And that actually helped to define me. And I don't think I would have been defined if I was starting my job out of college sitting in my bedroom, or worse still, sitting in a shared situation where I had to jostle over a position. I think we derive our identity from our work when we're at the very young stages. And it is important, just to the mention of culture, that culture is created in a place of work. And I firmly believe we will have to go back to something like that.
That's great. So final question from me. We've focused a lot on some of the negative aspects of new ways of working, although Aoifinn, you did talk about leveling the playing field to some extent. Is there anything we can take away from this that's positive? So if we fast forward 6 months from now, we're all vaccinated, we're in effectively a post-COVID world. What from current arrangements would we like to see retained in terms of working patterns that may actually be useful or beneficial for the work that you do and the deals that you're involved in? Anthony, do you want to have a crack at this first?
Sure. I think when Aoifinn talked about the Polycom in the middle of the conference room table, of course, that is, in many cases, a disaster. And I think the whole idea, even just going back a year, people were reticent to put on a screen, put themselves up and, be seen by others. So this communication form, because Zoom I'd been using for a few years, but a lot of people didn't like using it. And I think this has forced the pace of change a lot. So I think that is good. And I think it is useful to have a much more flexible way of engaging. So the international point of being able to see people, that's great. So I think this is good. The problem is I think that there's probably the balance is too much using it at home as opposed to perhaps using it in the office as an extra communication tool rather than the faceless use of the phone. I have to say, my mobile phone really doesn't ring very much these days. I just get booked in for a meeting on Zoom or Teams. That's it. So I think there are some, maybe some good things that come out of it. But I do feel that from a business perspective, we really do have to find a way to all get back to being in the same place, building that corporate identity and culture and teaching environment, which is so important, I think, for all of us.
Yes, I definitely don't think the social aspects will be killed off in the sense of the conferences or the events. I think we will be running back to in-person conferences. As I actually, I think what we all realize is conferences are about so much more than the content that gets delivered. It's about the enjoyment of bonding with colleagues and meeting new ones, connecting with old ones, and just the sheer buzz that comes from being with peers. Because I've been at a number of online conferences and they have been excellently executed, no question. I've been amazed at what they've been able to replicate, the use of videos, for example, to maybe profile a firm. But after the conference, you essentially press leave meeting and it's a massive anticlimax. So I think that everybody feels that, from the organizers to the attendees. So we're definitely going to return to industry events. I think for certain events, like say an annual meeting, where maybe the participants are not supposed to participate, that will be effective if that's beamed by Zoom or WebEx or whatnot, because I think that will perhaps be a much more efficient way. Even internally, a town hall can be beamed by Zoom instead of having everyone huddle around a podium. And that could also be, I think, quite effective. But I really do think that the time we spend together will be perhaps more strategic in that we will be using that for the collaborative sessions, for innovation, and perhaps we will be more strategic about how we use our space even. But I actually am hopeful that essentially most of how we do our work will not change that much.
Okay, well, Aoifinn and Anthony, thank you so much for your insights. And, there were lots of different points made there, but I think what I heard loud and clear really was the continued importance of face-to-face interactions in order to get work done in financial services. So thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And there should be a round of applause at this point somewhere. But,
it's the anticlimax of not being able to leave a meeting.
Thanks for listening to Connections. Subscribe for more insights into the issues shaping business, the economy, and society.